On March 9, 1976, tragedy struck the community of Oven Fork in Letcher County, Kentucky, after an explosion at the Scotia Mine killed 15 miners. 2 days later, a second explosion killed another 11 miners and federal inspectors, making the disaster one of the worst in U.S. history. Years of legal challenges rocked this close-knit eastern Kentucky community and raised important questions about the safety of coal mining. Join us today for a discussion with Professor Brian McKnight, who has befriended members of the mine recovery team. He will tell us more about this harrowing event and how the aftermath of the Scotia Mine disaster brought major changes to the U.S. coal industry, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. I'm Alan Fletcher, the host of Kentucky Chronicles, a podcast of the Kentucky Historical Society. I'm the associate editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, a scholarly journal in publication since 1903. I also coordinate our Research Fellows program. Kentucky Chronicles is a podcast that shares diverse histories from the Commonwealth and beyond. It is inspired by the works of researchers from across the world who have explored our rich archival holdings at the Kentucky Historical Society. Dr. Brian McKnight is Professor of History and founding director of the Center for Appalachian Studies at the University of Virginia's College at Wise. He has written Contested Borderland, The Civil War in Appalachian Kentucky and Virginia, Confederate Outlaw, Champ Ferguson and the Civil War in Appalachia, and We Fight for Peace, 23 American Soldiers, Prisoners of War, and Turncoats in the Korean War. He has served as editor of The Age of Jackson and The Guerrilla Hunters, Irregular Conflicts During the Civil War. Can you tell us just a little bit about how the coal industry, especially in southeastern Kentucky, is changing after World War II, and how does Scotia fit into all of this?
One of the big moments in the coal industry was the realization that somebody was going to have to regulate this in some way. And when you start thinking about the coal industry and coal regulation, what you see is this cycle of tragedy that then produces some sort of a regulatory movement, which then may or may not result in a law that will improve things. And that seems to always work. In the early 1900s, we created the Bureau of Mines, Federal Bureau of Mines, and their job was to oversee the coal industry, among others. But they didn't have any real enforcement authority. As a matter of fact, one of the coolest things I found right across town at the KDLA a few months ago was a letter from the Kentucky State Mine Commissioner, who wrote this small operator in Pike County, Kentucky, and he basically, in all caps, said, "You're going to get somebody killed if you don't do what we tell you to do." Mm-hmm. And that was the extent of their power. They couldn't shut mines down. They couldn't penalize them in any way. They could just point out the danger. That's the way it operates until 1969. In 1969, it changes because you have what becomes known as the Coal Act, or the 1969 Act. That's what Mesa and MSHA inspectors called it. You have this new law that is passed based on what happened at Farmington in West Virginia, where 78 were killed. With this new law, which finally put some teeth into the process, you still have a problem, because you have an inspectorate which for the past 60 years has had no authority whatsoever. And now they're given a law with some teeth. And the question is, how do we enforce this? How far can we go? A lot of them had no idea how far they could go. And a lot of them were somewhat pessimistic, because they knew that the moment they did something, the company was going to hire an attorney and sue somebody over it. And then all of a sudden they'd be dragged into it. And Mesa, Mesa is the next iteration of the Bureau of Mines in the early 1970s, and Mesa would be dragged into it. So in the early 1970s, you have these various transitions, whether it's the creation of MESA, Mine Enforcement and Safety Administration, or the new mine law, the Coal Act of 1969, which are really trying to change things and improve things for the better. But at the same time, you have a lot of guys who don't necessarily know how to manage this process. And you're not going to see anybody really get a clear idea about how to manage the process until the Scotia explosions. And it comes out in the Scotia explosions. Within just 2 or 3 weeks of the explosions, they have congressional hearings over in Whitesburg, Kentucky, which is only about 15 miles from where the Scotia Mine was. And it's obvious that very few people within Mesa understood how to really manage this process in a way that would force coal operators to really do the right thing and to play a safe game.
It's interesting you note this cycle where we have some kind of regulatory power. In this case, it's the 1969 Coal Act, which was significant. And here we are only 7 years later, and something like Scotia happens. So this might be a familiar event, especially for residents of coal country. But for those who might be unfamiliar, what did happen at Scotia in 1976? Can you walk us through how events are unfolding?
Sure. March 9th, 1976. I think it's Tuesday. Men go in to work. They are getting ready for lunch, and there's an explosion deep into the mine. And when I say deep into the mine, about 3.5 miles deep into the mine. What has happened here is the Scotia Coal Company has these very long shafts where they're penetrating horizontally along this coal seam. And most of the coal around Scotia is, 5.5, 6 feet high. They've got this shaft that's going out maybe 3,000 feet. And when they got to a certain point, and this was maybe 2 months before, when they got to a certain point, that coal got higher. And their machinery, mining machinery, was small enough that it could not get the high coal. So the company says, well, this is great news. We got high coal. We're going to make a lot more money. We're going to have to buy a new machine, but that's what we're going to do. So what they do is where that coal starts getting high, they seal it off with curtains. And instead of ventilating all the way down that shaft around and then back out, they seal it off. And then they start going in off the side of the shaft to continue mining coal and continue making money until this new piece of equipment shows up, which will then allow them to reopen the other shaft. What they did by sealing that off and depriving that area of ventilation was they allowed methane gas to build up down there. And where it got high, methane being lighter than air, tended to build up from the top down. So this area is collecting methane gas. It is seeping a little bit out into the main area there, but there's nothing up in there to ignite it. So, as for that moment, everything's okay. Seeping out, and it's going out in the ventilation. Well, on this certain day, March 9th, the men who are mining this little side shaft, they go in and they're at work. There's 13 of them. And they send 2 men up into the old shaft. And they go up into the old shaft with 2 locomotives that are hauling rails because the machine they've been waiting on is supposed to be delivered pretty soon. So they need to extend the rails all the way up to the working face, and they're going to be able to bring this machine in there, and they're going to be able to get right back to work. Well, one of these machines that they use, one of these locomotives, is a 1943 model. So this is a 33-year-old machine at the time. And what it has on it is it has an air brake system. The brakes operate off air. The air is pressurized by a compressor. And when air pressure drops below a certain point, that compressor automatically kicks on and it recharges the brakes. The men who worked there said when that compressor kicked on, you could see a visible spark. And that's what they took up there. So they take it up there, air compressor kicks on, massive explosion, kills 15 people. And that happens right around lunchtime, March 9th, 1976. Well, you get calls going everywhere almost immediately. They've got to call the federal inspectors, Mesa. And as a matter of fact, the nearest Mesa office is in Whitesburg. And at that very moment, in the Mesa office in Whitesburg, you have a Scotia representative sitting with inspectors trying to explain why they haven't been submitting ventilation reports. So this is part of the problem. They've been dragging their feet on a lot of this stuff. They've been falsifying stuff. That's what we'll figure out later on. So here the news comes in that there's been an explosion. The company's informed, federal authorities are informed, state authorities are informed, and all of a sudden you have everybody kind of coming to Oven Fork, Kentucky in Letcher County. It gets so big that the Kentucky Commissioner of Mines, Harold Kirkpatrick, comes. He's there in 3 hours with his people. Robert Barrett, who's the Mesa administrator in Washington, D.C., he's there in 3 or 4 hours by plane. And the man in charge is a Mesa inspector supervisor. He's a subdistrict manager out of Norton, a guy named Bill Clemens. And Bill Clemens has been around for a long time. He goes way back into the Bureau of Mines. Very well respected, good inspector. People tend to really like him. But he's the first one there. He's the man on the ground, and he'll essentially take control and remain in control throughout the entire process. One of the first things they do is they decide that they need to mobilize mine rescue teams. Now, mine rescue has been around for a long time. I think the International Harvester team, or maybe it was U.S. Steel team, I think those teams go back into like 1913. I have no idea what they're doing in 1913 with the technology they might have had, but they were mine rescue even that far back. Benham, Kentucky has International Harvester. They're mining coal for Wisconsin Steel. Lynch, Kentucky has U.S. Steel mining coal for itself. And they're only about 20 minutes down the road from Oven Fork. So they mobilize. Right across the mountain in Virginia, you've got Westmoreland Coal Company. They've got a fairly new mine rescue team. They just got it started in 1971. And all these guys have been able to do since 1971 is practice, and drink beer. That's kind of what they did.
Not sure that's a good combination.
And then up the road a little bit in Jenkins, Kentucky, you have Beth Elkhorn, which is Bethlehem Steel. And then you have National Mines up at Wayland, Kentucky, and they mined. I don't know who they were mining for at the time, but they eventually were bought out by U.S. Steel, and they became a U.S. Steel mine too. But these are all kind of captive mines. So you've got all these mine rescue teams converging on Oven Fork. But this explosion takes place around 11:30 or so a.m. By about 3:30, you've got all these folks arriving. Heck, everybody in the community's heard about it by now. There are hundreds of people there. They've allowed the family members to come in, and they've put them in the bathhouse. And the way a coal mine bathhouse works is kind of eerie. You know, when this mine blew up, everybody got the heck out of there. And all those guys who got out of there, they were sent home because we weren't going to be working anymore today, and you guys need to be out of the way for what we've got to do. So you go into the bathhouse in the morning, you take off your regular clothes and you put them in a basket, and you hoist that basket to the top and you hook it. And then when you get off, you take your dirty clothes, you throw them over here to be washed, you take a shower, you lower your clothes, and you get dressed and go home. Well, these families of these 15 men are taken into the bathhouse to wait for word about what's going on. Are they alive? You know, what's happening? And they look up and they can see the 15 pots, baskets with the clothing hanging above them. They know what that means. They have the full scale rescue being attempted, but they still don't know what's happened in here, really. They know there's been an explosion, but they don't know what the conditions are. But they've got a guy, and this guy's named John Hackworth. And John Hackworth was a miner. He was working on one end of a belt that brought coal out. At the time of the explosion, he's working at the other end of the belt, maybe 2,000 feet away. The force of the explosion rolls him about 30 feet, but he hops up. And instead of leaving with everybody else he's working with, he puts on a self-rescuer and goes into the mine to see what's happened. He's particularly worried about a guy he just got started on the other end of the belt. Really young guy. Didn't have much experience. Hackworth gets into about maybe 400 feet away from where 13 of these 15 guys were working. And he's overcome and he has to come back out. And when he gets outside, he's the only person who really kind of knows what they can expect when they go in there. So Hackworth's an important part of kind of briefing Mesa, the state, these individual mine rescue teams. He's going to go, tell them what to expect, what he saw, how far he went, that kind of thing. The mine rescue teams then start getting called in. And by this time, there are a handful of Mesa and state inspectors who have gone into the mine, and they've gone to the point to where they can tell that there's going to be a poisonous atmosphere. They don't know if they're seeing dust or if it's smoke. You really hope there isn't. And when the mine rescue teams arrive, what they begin doing is reestablishing ventilation to the mine. One of the things I found in this project is that every entity has a different priority. And one of the things that, and I worry that MSHA people will take this the wrong way, but, Mesa and MSHA, they have mine rescue teams. But in the reading that I've done about this, the MSHA mine rescue teams are primarily there to essentially secure the scene for the investigation. They're not necessarily there for the rescue aspect of it. And my research has kind of proven this. The one thing that always gets me when people say, well, they were there for the rescue. The Mesa teams that came out of Pittsburgh, they didn't even know how to operate their equipment. They had these new breathing apparatuses, and they were taking them out of the cardboard boxes when they arrived. And so that kind of tells you, the approach is a little different. For most of these company mine rescue teams, they are really hoping to find live miners because they're miners. They're not, they're not company administrators. They're not inspectors like the Mesa teams. They're really hoping to save somebody's life that day. So when they get underground, they've got to reestablish ventilation. And what they'll do is they'll create a fresh air base. And it's the point at which you can take all your stuff off and breathe fresh air. And then they'll send people under oxygen about 5 crosscuts, which a crosscut's about 100 feet, so about 500 feet. And they will reestablish ventilation all the way down there. And when they get down there, they'll seal it at the end, and it's a new fresh air basin, and everybody can move up. And that's how they do it. They'll do that until they get to the very end, and then they'll be able to open it up and ventilate the entire area again. Now, what had happened is when these two guys went through that curtain, see, the thing about methane will not explode below 5% of atmosphere. It won't explode over 15% of atmosphere. So between 5 and 15% is your explosive mix. When they opened that curtain and that area was filled with methane, suddenly they create an explosive mix. And that's what set everything off. So here you have it. You have these guys, they're going up in there. By about 10 p.m. that night, the first body is found. Over the course of the next couple of hours, they locate the other 12 bodies in that area where they were mining coal. And then they send a couple of other teams forward down that long shaft to find those last two guys who were basically at the epicenter of this explosion. And they do that, and they bring them all out. They bring them outside the mine. They announce it to the families. The mine had gotten a local minister to basically break the news to the families. And the story on that is he basically got up on a box and said, "Hey, I have some news." And then he said, "They're all dead." So,
Wow.
I guess breaking the news to the family was not his strong suit.
And it doesn't necessarily get any better because there was a second explosion.
Yeah, yeah. What ends up happening is they got everybody out of the mine. As far as Mesa's concerned, they need to figure out what happened here. So they're getting people together to go back in, do full remediation, get all of the ventilation reestablished, get fresh air moving through there, and keep it safe. It takes them about 2 days to really, 2.5 days actually, to really get to the point to where they're ready to start working. They go in and they take a look around, and this is maybe a day and a half later. They find a part in the roof where they're going to have to go under to go up that long shaft where the two men were. The Mesa inspectors, the Mesa rescue team members, they didn't like the roof. They said, "This is bad roof. It's dangerous roof. We're going to have to fix the roof before we do anything." Now, it's funny. I've talked to Mesa inspectors who are local, who worked in that mine, one of whom became the head of Mesa in the early 2000s, or MSHA in the early 2000s. And they basically say, it didn't look terrible to me. It looked like a lot of the roof you're going to see in the Imboden seam. But these guys are Pennsylvania coal miners. They haven't seen the Imboden seam. And they're apparently not really taking people's word for it. So they decide that before we do anything, we're going to have to move a roof bolt machine over here, and we're going to bolt this roof and make sure it's safe. So what they do, and this is 60 hours after the first explosion, they bring in a work crew of 10 Scotia employees and 3 federal inspectors. And the federal inspectors are going to oversee the work of these Scotia employees, and they're going to fix the roof first, they're going to reestablish ventilation, and they're going to get everything ready to where they can actually investigate this explosion. They get the roof bolt machine into position, and it blows up a second time. What has happened is you've got methane building up again down there, and it found an ignition source. Now, everybody I've talked to says the ignition source was that compressor, and it stands to reason that it would be. But there's a complication that I hope you won't let me forget to talk about before we finish here. So it blows up a second time. It kills all 3 federal inspectors. It kills 8 of the 10 Scotia workers. 2 of the Scotia workers were dragging a cable for the bolting machine to an electrical box. And they had just climbed over a pile of gravel, basically, and had ducked down behind that pile of gravel, and it blew up and it blew right over them. And they were saved. They said they couldn't see anything. They were right together, and they found an overhead telephone line, and they followed it until it went out. They got within like 2,500 or 3,000 feet of the entry of the mine, and they picked up a phone that was working, and they said, "Hey, we've had another explosion." They said, "Oh my God, we'll come get you." And by the time they got the car inside the mine to come get them, these guys were already out. I mean, they were running by that point. So they were in a big, big hurry. So we've had a second explosion 60 hours later, 2.5 days later. It's about midnight when this thing blows up. And suddenly the call goes out to all the Mesa people and the Kentucky Department of Mines people and all these company rescue teams who had sent folks before. And it's interesting, you talk to these guys, and it's pretty universal. They say, we were scared when we went in the first time, but we were terrified the second time because we knew there was something not right here. And one of my favorite quotes was from Ray McKinney. Ray became MSHA administrator, and I think he was MSHA administrator in D.C. from 2002 to 2006. It ran the whole show. He was on the U.S. Steel Rescue Team at the time. And he said that one of the guys he was with when they went back in the second time said the guy looked over at him and said, "Do you reckon they know what they're doing here?" And Ray said that his comment was, "Well, I think it takes a lot of effort to blow a mine up once. It'd take a lot of effort to blow a mine up twice." So nobody trusted what was going on there at that point. I mean, this was absolutely unknown. But it's happened. And it's on national news again for the second time in 3 days. They send mine rescue teams into the portal, into the main entry. But it's so far in there. And they've only got 1 hour machines, maybe 2 hour machines. They're going to have to walk 4.5 miles, grab bodies, and then come out. They're not going to be able to do this. So Mesa decides we're going to try something different. Scotia had, because it's so far in there, Scotia had been paying its miners for the transportation in and the transportation out, which worked out to be about an hour a day. They were paying them to ride to work and back. So they had this idea, we're going to drill a hole, we're going to put an elevator in, and we're going to be able to get them to the work crew a lot faster, and over time it'll save us a lot of money. Well, at the time, it's just a 376-foot hole in the ground, 13.5 feet wide. But they decide we're going to get a crane, we're going to get a little basket, and we're going to lower people into that hole, which then is only about 2,500 feet from where we know those inspectors and those other miners were at the time of the explosion. They lower them down 3 at a time. And I can supply you with some images to pepper throughout this presentation. The crane did not inspire confidence. It was old, it was raggedy. There was this little bitty basket with 3 guys crammed into it. Said that it was just a wad of wires at the top clamped together, and they were hoping whoever did the clamping was conscientious that day. And the crane did not have a swivel. So when it lowered you, you spun. Well, you got to be lowered 376 feet. You're going to do an awful lot of spinning down and back. And every time it made a revolution, there was a tooth missing off the gear. So you dropped a little bit. It just scared them to death. And these guys said, we got in there and we started down. They told us, they said, well, about 100 feet down, there's a pipe you might have to kick yourself away from. Which, the first thing they're thinking is that pipe's going to catch the bottom of this thing and dump us upside down, and we're going to fall to our deaths here. Well, they made it down 3 at a time. And it's really funny to me. I mean, I understand why they do it, but at the same time, I don't understand why they do it. You've got 6 or 8 federal and state people down there. You've got 2 Westmoreland Coal Company mine rescue teams going down. That's 6 people per team, so that's 12 people. So we're up to, let's say 4, 5, 6. Let's say we're up to 6 trips down and back there. And then they decide that there needs to be a backup team. So they send National Mines down. That's another 2 trips. I I mean, you're up to like 8 trips up and down. It takes like 12 or 15 minutes to go down.
And I'm sure the people who went down first were getting more anxious too.
Yeah, I bet they were. Now, those were federal inspectors primarily. If something happens, nobody's going to be able to help anybody down there. It's just going to be more people to die. So, Westmoreland, and it's a really funny story. The guy who was Westmoreland's trainer was a fellow named Lewis Henniger, and he was a little bitty guy that everybody seemed to respect. He had grown up in Lynch and worked U.S. Steel. He was in U.S. Steel Mine Rescue, and he was involved in the Robina explosion in 1962 in Pennsylvania. And so he had real experience. They said that they were all standing around, people talking about dropping teams down a hole, and these Westmoreland guys were like, "Gosh, we feel sorry for whoever that has to be." And said when they asked for volunteers, they heard Lewis say, "My boys will go."
Oh,
Said their hearts just dropped to their feet when they heard that.
oh goodness.
So they get dropped down there. They're carrying 500-foot lengths of telephone lines. So they hook into a telephone line and they go 500 feet and then they hook into another line. And that's to maintain communication out. They've got one team that's going up 500 feet, hooking in. The other team is coming behind them, going past them 500 feet and hooking in. And they get there and they're only carrying 4 of these rolls of 500-foot line, but they've got to go about 2,500 feet. So when they got to 2,000 feet and ran out of telephone line, they were like, let's just go find bodies. So they run in there, full sprint. They locate the bodies, map the bodies, and then they run out. And they were terrified. One of the guys, Matt Smith, his comment was, "We picked them up and put them down on the way out of there." So they were in a very big hurry to get out. So they get back, they're brought out of this hole, and everything's okay for the moment. They go home. Mesa and the state have to figure something out. Bodies haven't been retrieved. Families want closure. They want a body to have a service over and to bury. Plus, Farmington, which exploded in 1968, there was still like 40 bodies underground in 1976. Heck, there are like 20 bodies still underground at Farmington in 2025 that they've never gotten out and never will get out. So there's this fear that Mesa and state mine officials might leave these bodies. The state, federal, and Scotia Coal Company, parent company is Blue Diamond Coal, they decide that we need to seal this mine. So on the 15th, first explosion's on the 9th, second one's on the 11th. On the 15th, they seal the mine. And what they do is they seal all the entrances. They drop down certain instruments that allowed them to remotely read methane levels, carbon monoxide levels, that sort of thing. And they say, we're going to basically let this thing fill up with methane, and then we're going to very strategically reopen it and ventilate it little by little to the point to where we can be safe again. That is a very long process. They began reopening the mine in July. This takes place in March. They begin reopening in July. It's not going to be reopened until November. So this is an 8-month-long process. In the midst of all this, all these family members are really angry because it doesn't seem like anybody is in a hurry to retrieve these bodies. Very upset, very frustrated with everything that's going on. A lot of them actually say, and Westmoreland mine rescue guys got telephone calls from people saying, you guys didn't go in there. You didn't actually find those bodies. It really hurt their feelings because they had taken their lives in their own hands to do that. But there, during that period of time, it's a really difficult 8 months for everybody. One of the things that's really interesting about all this is, John Hackworth, that guy who went into the mine after the first explosion and tried to figure out, if there was anything to save there, and came back out. Then he provided everybody with all this information about what he had seen and where he'd gone and what they could expect. While the first recovery teams are in there, he stays and he's driving a vehicle in and out of the mine, bringing materials into these guys. And the Westmoreland guys are amazing. They said, we really liked him. Said he was our age and he had been in there and he had seen what was going on. Funny guy, easy to get along with, easy to like. And they really kind of bonded with him for the 8 or 10 hours they were underground with him. Well, when they went in and found the second set of bodies 2 days later, they found John Hackworth down there too. He had volunteered to go back in and try to help get everything straight. And, it's a tragic tale. It really is. But I've been lucky. I tracked down his son, who was only 6 months old at the time. His son and his grandson are just so excited about all this. I borrowed documents from them and they had all this interesting stuff. And I told them, I said, we're going to do something at Mountain Empire Community College where these guys are going to tell their story. You're invited. Well, here comes John Hackworth Jr. before the event. And I thought about it and I said, these guys were so taken with his dad. So I took him aside and I said, listen, I want you to meet these guys, but don't do it before they start talking. Wait until after the program is over, because I'm afraid it'll really make him emotional. And afterward, he came up and introduced himself. And let me tell you, a bunch of happy people to kind of get a little bit of closure for themselves when it came to this thing. So it's been a wonderful project. There's a lot. You've got the Scotia explosions, but then you've got court cases afterward, and you've got all this other stuff that goes into settling whether Blue Diamond or Scotia is going to have to pay for anything and what widows are going to get out of this. So it's a fascinating project, and I've been really fortunate that these guys that I've run into, particularly with Westmoreland, but now I also had really good experiences with Ray McKinney and Jim Vicini. They worked U.S. Steel, and Leonard Fleming, who worked the rescue for Beth Elkhorn too. So I've been lucky. I've had a lot of people who are really interested in helping develop the story.
You do such a good job bringing out the human element of this disaster, I think, because as you note, these are fathers, their husbands, their brothers who have probably mined coal their whole lives, and it's a traumatic community event. And anyone who knows anything about Eastern Kentucky, Appalachia, communities stick together, and these kinds of events can really rock communities. And so I'll come back to that for the last question. But in the aftermath of Scotia, of this explosion, what's changing? Is anything changing on the part of the federal government or coal companies to make sure this doesn't happen again? We know that happened with the 1969 Coal Act after Farmington, but here we are, and these disasters keep happening. So what happens afterwards?
It gets a lot of publicity in Washington, D.C., and we're lucky because Carl Perkins, who grew up in Eastern Kentucky and actually grew up with the family of one of the men who died in the second explosion. Carl Perkins is a major figure in Congress at the time. He was one of the primary authors of the 1969 Act. And he's the one who leads the charge to kind of figure out what the problems were and how to change things. And he becomes one of the major driving figures behind what's going to become the 1977 Mine Act. The 1977 Mine Act is going to really put some teeth into things. There were a few things going on. The Department of Interior is tasked with managing the nation's resources. And the Bureau of Mines fell under the Department of Interior. So you got, on the one hand, the Department of Interior essentially advocating for the use of coal, And then on the other hand, the Department of Interior governing the regulation of the coal industry. That just is not going to happen. So, Mine Enforcement and Safety Administration, MESA, gets converted to the Mine Safety and Health Administration in 1977, and it moves out of the Department of Interior and moves to the Department of Labor. And that removes the conflict of interest there, at least, ostensibly. The new Mine Act is much more vigorous. And one of the things that I'm most proud of, and I try to make these mine rescue guys understand, the reason why companies are required to have mine rescue teams as of 1977 is because of what these guys did at Scotia. They saw these guys at Scotia and said, my God, everybody needs a team of those guys. They're conscientious, they're brave, they understand the mine. And that's one thing we don't think about. You've got these mines and they're huge. But unless you work in it, you don't necessarily understand the interior dynamic of it. You can have a map. Ray McKinney worked at Scotia up until just a few months before it blew up. And then he went to U.S. Steel, and then he very quickly went to Mesa. Ray said, he was probably an important player in that because he was the only person on his team who had been in that mine before. And to give you a kind of an illustration of this, one of my favorite interviews is a guy named Nick Brewer. Nick was a longtime Mesa and then later MSHA inspector. He had a guy who had a mine over near St. Paul, Virginia. He said, and this is an old mine, it went everywhere. And he said that they got a call one evening as they were leaving work and said, the guy who owns the mine went in, he hasn't come out yet. We have no idea what's wrong with him. So everybody went up there thinking maybe he'd gone in, he'd gotten himself hurt, had a heart attack or something. He said, and as they're getting ready to go in the mine, they smell smoke. This guy had gotten lost in his own coal mine. Coal mine he had been working in for 30 years, gotten lost in it, built a fire to draw the rescuers in to find him. So, you may have a map, but that may not mean a whole lot at the time. So that's just one of those illustrations.
Well, you talk a lot about the personal relationships that you've built up, not only with miners, but some of the mine safety officials. And I think this is actually a good way to draw us to a close, because I always like talking with researchers about their methods. And you're in a unique position because this is a pretty recent development. I mean, there are people who still remember this within the community. In theory, some of these miners, if they were young in '76, would still be alive today if the explosion hadn't happened. So, have there been any challenges of doing a project like this where it's still within living memory for a lot of people in the community? How is the disaster being remembered?
Well, I'll tell you, it's a mixed bag. Most of the people I've talked to are pretty willing to talk about it. There's been a lot of water under the bridge. But there are a handful of people who don't want to talk about it. There are a handful of people who kind of idealize certain things. We're talking about coal in eastern Kentucky. I did a thing with these mine rescue guys over in Whitesburg a few months ago, and it went well. But there was this one guy. He was just really upset the whole time. I mean, we weren't being fair to Scotia, and I think I said, well, they had like 870 some violations written in the preceding 4 years. Oh, that doesn't matter. Well, come to find out, he was one of the last presidents of the Scotia Employee Association, which was the company union. So he's going to remember it a certain way because he's got a vested interest in this. He's part of that history. And there are a lot of people who, and it's hard for me to understand, but there are a lot of people who look at things like Scotia and somehow twist it into, this was what has taken all of our coal jobs away. People made a big deal about this. And, they don't want to say only 26 people died, but, they're kind of sort of leading you to believe that, yeah, people die every day. It's not a huge thing. We shouldn't worry too much about it. But I'll tell you what, if you take a look at mine deaths prior to 1977, and you take a look at mine deaths after 1977, you'll see that regulation works. There is no way to argue that point. Now, you'll also be reminded that there are a lot fewer miners, but regulation certainly does work. I've had a few people who, they, particularly the widows, they've remarried. They don't want to remember that. But a lot of people, whether it's the mine rescue folks or people who worked there or some of the descendants, they're so interested in learning. John Hackworth Jr., whenever I went down and met him, he said, "Oh, I've got some stuff here. Let's take a look through this stuff and see if there's anything in here you're interested in." He pulled out a chest, and I bet he had 10,000 pages worth of stuff in there. He had letters. The widows, they ended up collecting a huge settlement after this is over. It takes 4 or 5 years. But he had letters in there from men who were writing his mother saying, "Hey, I own a big farm. I'm looking for a wife." They don't say I'm looking for a wife who may come into a lot of money very soon, but they say I'm looking for a wife. He had incredible amounts of information. It was just amazing. Now, let me go back to something here. So I mentioned before that the first explosion, we're very clear that the first explosion was caused by that sparking compressor. Well, the second explosion, everybody assumed it was a sparking compressor. And you may say, why are they assuming? Because, it was 2 days later and we know about the first one. Because when the Scotia widows filed suit, the federal judge in eastern Kentucky, a guy named David Hermansdorfer, he sealed the report on Scotia and did not allow access to that report. Now, this is 1976. He seals it until 1993. 1993. So for 17 years, nobody knows anything other than what's being said. When the report was finally released in 1993, it basically said, we don't know what caused it. We know it wasn't the same cause the second time because those batteries were destroyed or the connections were destroyed. We think there was a piece of machinery over in that little side cut and a piece of rock fell on it and caused a spark that did it. Because they found the machinery, they found the rock, and they could tell that the explosion radiated away from that. But they tried to take part of that rock and drop it on a similar kind of machinery in a controlled environment, and it never would spark. So they don't know, they really just don't know conclusively what the cause for the second one was. But I guess where we stand 49 years later, the causes are only important up to a certain point. Now, you were talking about the difficulty of researching it. I'm a Civil War guy. I do a lot of different stuff, but I started out as a Civil War guy. And one of the things I was really conscious about, and I'm still conscious about, is everybody that I've always done research on, they're dead. And they're so long dead that I can't do any damage. With oral histories and living subjects, I get really concerned that I'm going to do some damage. And that's part of the reason why I told John Hackworth Jr. not to approach these guys until after we finished. I knew these guys really would love to meet him. I had had dozens of conversations with them, and they were like, "Oh man, I've wondered whatever happened to his family, And it turned out well. It was a judgment call, I guess. I talked to a couple of them just in the past few days, and they're planning on getting together with him and his family and kind of just chit-chatting and maintaining a connection, which I think is a wonderful thing. But yeah, when you're doing oral history and really contemporary history, there's some things you have to take into consideration that, the traditionalists of us, we don't necessarily really need to think very much about. It's kind of intimidating because, as I said, I don't want to do any damage. I hope I do some good, but I'll do no damage if I have to.
For those of us who do 20th century history full-time, those are questions we're always having to think about, for sure. And so next year is the 50th anniversary. It feels bad to call it an anniversary, but what are your plans? Do you plan to make this into a book or an article or anything like that?
University Press of Kentucky has a prospectus right now, and I hope they'll go ahead and give me a thumbs up, and we can get moving on it. It's turned out pretty well. I've got a bunch of people reading it. One of the most valuable readers I have is a guy who managed MSHA's safety program at the MSHA Academy in Beckley, West Virginia for about 50 years. So I think he started there in 1972 and just retired a couple months ago. So I'm really excited to have his feedback because he essentially lived this entire regulatory process and then turned to teach the process over the years too. So it's been a great experience. Made a lot of good friends. I think I did a little bit of good with it. I think, somewhere in my neighborhood, there's a guy who has this really big diesel truck, and his license plate says EPA LOL. I gather he is not a fan of regulation. But every time I see that truck, I think, I don't know the guy, I don't know what he does for a living. But every time I see that truck and that tag, I think, I wonder how many times his life or somebody, near to him, their life has been saved because of the same regulation that he's LOLing. And if you take a look at the numbers,
They don't lie.
no, they don't lie. But that's what we're fighting against, particularly now, we're in a very anti-regulatory environment. And we know that there is going to be a price to pay at some point. I mean, if you downsize regulatory offices, you're going to have a return to those problems that you saw years ago. How are we going to celebrate this, or how are we going to remember it? It was interesting. I was sitting at KHS about a month ago, and I met with the guy who works there. You'll probably have to remind me his name, but he runs the state highway markers.
Oh, Jim Seaver.
Yeah, Jim Seaver. And Jim came out and he said, I hear you're working on Scotia. Sure. He said, we put up a highway marker there 15 years ago. And we got a batch of these markers. They had the gold paint on the letters, but that gold paint's been bleeding off. We've got a brand new highway marker sitting in Pikeville just waiting to be installed. So I said, hold that thought. So what I'm trying to do, and I've got some help on this, but I'm trying to mobilize a group in Pikeville, Whitesburg, Harlan, Cumberland, to come together on March 9th, 2026, and replace the highway marker with the brand new one. I think it would be a wonderful thing to do, be a perfect moment to do it. And you know how it is. Even though people may not want to remember certain parts of this, for the good of history, for the good of the entire historical community and our entire civilization and culture, we have to remember these things. And I'm really looking forward to getting that done in March. And I've got my fingers crossed that we're going to have full cooperation and participation, but we'll see how it goes. That's the ambition, though.
Well, we look forward to whatever you produce from this research, and I think those are some really nice closing thoughts. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us on this interview today.
Well, thank you, Alan. I've enjoyed it. I love getting out and kind of talking to people about what I'm working on. I teach a lot of Appalachian history, and if you ask people from the Appalachian region what's important about their region, they struggle to tell you. But because Appalachian history has largely been written by outsiders, and it's been written by corporate interest and lobbying interest, it's hard to nail this stuff down for the average person. And I have been really pleased with my ability or my opportunity to talk about some of these things, which I consider to be very, very important, and I hope other people will consider important too.
The Scotia Mine disaster brought major changes to the U.S. coal industry. 1 year after the explosions, the Federal Mine Safety and Health Act of 1977 strengthened existing mine safety laws. Meanwhile, the widows of 15 men who died in the explosions sued Blue Diamond Coal. The case came to a close in 1980, with Blue Diamond providing a $5.5 million settlement to the widows. Other mining disasters have occurred in recent decades, including a 2010 explosion at the Upper Big Branch mine in West Virginia that killed 29 miners. Yet as Dr. McKnight notes, mine safety laws have historically worked in saving lives. March 2026 will mark 50 years since the Scotia Mine disaster. You can also be on the lookout for Professor McKnight's upcoming book. This closes another episode. Thanks to Dr. Brian McKnight for talking with me today. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society, with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is produced by Gregory Hardison, with support from Dr. Stephanie Lang. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. To learn more about our publication of the Register or our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe. You can also help us build a following by telling your friends and colleagues. I look forward to welcoming our next guest on Kentucky Chronicles.